There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a storage room when researchers realize they are holding something they were never supposed to find. It is the silence of a door creaking open that someone very powerful spent decades trying to keep shut. That is exactly the feeling that descended when archivists and researchers began carefully working through the personal papers, letters, financial records, and private correspondence that Lawrence Welk left behind after his death in 1992. What they expected to find was confirmation of the legend, the wholesome bandleader, the cheerful grandfather of American television, the man who kept the country safe inside a warm bubble of champagne music and family values every Saturday night. What they actually found was something far more complicated, far more human, and in several important ways, far more disturbing. The Lawrence Welk that lived inside those archives bore only a passing resemblance to the man millions of Americans had invited into their living rooms for decades. Behind the smiles and the bubbles, behind the careful wardrobe and the polished broadcast manners, was a man driven by something much harder than warmth. He was driven by a hunger for control that had been forged in one of the most unforgiving environments in American history, and that hunger never left him, not when he was famous, not when he was wealthy, and not when the cameras were rolling. To understand what the archive reveals, you have to start where Lawrence Welk himself started, because his origins explain almost everything that came afterward. Lawrence Welk was born on March 11, 1903, in Strasburg, North Dakota, a place so isolated and so harsh that it barely registered on any map that mattered. His family were part of a community of German-speaking Catholic immigrants who had originally come from the Odessa region of the Russian Empire, fleeing poverty and religious persecution. When the Welk family arrived in North Dakota in 1892, they found not the promised land but something that tested the very limits of human endurance. Their first winter on the northern plains nearly killed them. Blizzards descended with temperatures dropping to 40 degrees below zero, and the family had no proper shelter waiting. They overturned their covered wagon, stacked sod bricks around it, and crawled inside with 8 people packed together, surviving on shared body heat, frozen strips of dried meat, and prayers that the wind would eventually stop screaming. Neighbors died. Livestock perished. The Welks endured by digging for roots and trapping small animals. That origin story was not simply family folklore. It was the foundation of a worldview. The message encoded into Lawrence Welk from his very earliest awareness was simple and absolute. The world is brutal, comfort is not guaranteed, and survival belongs only to those who refuse to break. He grew up in a household where German was the only language spoken, which meant that when he sat in school, the lessons happening around him were in a language he could not fully access. He felt foreign in a country he had been born into. That experience of being an outsider, of working twice as hard just to keep up with children who hadn't had to overcome what he had overcome, shaped him in ways the archive makes unmistakably clear. He left school after 4th grade. By the age of 10, he was a full farm laborer. His days were organized around work that would exhaust a grown man, milking cows in pre-dawn darkness, plowing fields behind nervous horses, cutting wheat by hand, hauling water from a creek that was never close enough, repairing tools in a blacksmith shop, and standing guard against coyotes circling the chicken yard. There was no leisure in this childhood. His father was strict and physically demanding, and falling short of expectations carried swift consequences. What might have broken another boy instead calcified inside Lawrence Welk into something that proved enormously useful later. An absolute refusal to acknowledge defeat, combined with a near-complete inability to tolerate weakness in anyone around him. Music entered his life through one of those small childhood moments that turn out to carry enormous weight. His father played a push-button accordion at the barn dances that offered the community its only real relief from the grinding rhythm of farm life. One evening, when Lawrence was perhaps 6 years old, his father let him touch the instrument's keys. The sound that came back hit the boy with a force he described in later interviews as something close to a physical shock. In that lantern-lit barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and the sound of boots stomping across a wooden floor, he understood for the first time that there was a world beyond the farm, and that music might be the door into it. The years that followed were years of secret obsession. He fashioned crude instruments out of whatever he could scavenge. He listened to every musician who passed through the community. And when he was a teenager, He approached his father with a proposal that showed exactly the kind of calculating patience that would later make him a formidable businessman. He wanted a professional accordion. The instrument cost $400, a genuinely staggering sum for a struggling immigrant farming family in early 20th century North Dakota. The negotiation that followed produced one of the most remarkable deals in the history of popular music. Lawrence agreed to work the family farm without any wages until his 21st birthday, and every cent he earned from playing music during those years would flow directly back into the family household. In exchange, he would have his accordion. He held up his end completely. He worked without complaint, practiced until his fingertips blistered and then practiced more, and when he slipped away to play at local weddings and dances, sometimes deceiving his father about where he was going, the money always came home as agreed. On March 11, 1924, his 21st birthday, the contract expired. He packed the accordion into its worn case, put on his only good jacket, tucked $3 bills into the lining as his entire financial reserve, and boarded a train out of North Dakota. He was heading toward a life he could not fully picture yet, armed with almost no money, a foreign accent, and a stubborn certainty that he was going to make something of himself or exhaust himself trying. The early years on the road were genuinely hard. He played in drafty halls for audiences that sometimes liked him and sometimes didn't. He slept in cheap rooms or not at all. He botched performances and faced the humiliation of hostile crowds. Once, after a particularly bad polka, members of the audience threw bottles. He kept going. He joined traveling variety shows and vaudeville outfits working the Midwest circuit, and it was in one of these outfits that a promoter made a decision that accidentally shaped Welk's entire career. With no basis in reality whatsoever, the promoter began advertising Lawrence Welk as the world's greatest accordion player. Welk knew perfectly well this was nonsense. He was still raw, still rough, still tangling up his English introductions in ways that drew laughter from audiences. But he also understood something important. The claim forced him to meet expectations. Crowds who had been promised greatness were watching for it. So he practiced with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, and over time, the gap between the promotional claim and the reality began to close. This experience taught him a lesson about image and aspiration that never left him. What you present yourself to be has a way of pulling you toward it, provided you are willing to do the work. By the time he arrived at Yankton, South Dakota in 1924 and stumbled, dusty and underprepared, into an audition at a local radio station, he had developed an instinct for what ordinary people actually wanted to hear. The audition was chaotic and imperfect, but farmers tuning in across the region responded immediately. Within a week, a one-week booking had extended into something much longer. Radio gave him reach he had never had from a barn stage. He also met Fern Renner there, the woman who became his wife. The accident of that timing changed his trajectory entirely, turning a wandering musician into a regional figure with a growing audience and a reason to stay in one place long enough to build something real. His strategy evolved throughout the 1930s. While swing bands and jazz combos chased the hot sounds that critics celebrated, Welk went deliberately in the opposite direction. He leaned into polish, order, and accessibility. When he appeared at Chicago's Trianon Ballroom in 1940, sharing a stage with the shadows of Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey, his approach seemed almost quaintly gentle by comparison. But dancers stayed on the floor through his entire set, and that mattered more to ballroom operators than critical approval. During one of those Chicago performances, a woman leaned over and told him his music reminded her of champagne, light, bubbly, and celebratory. He seized on that description immediately and turned it into the cornerstone of his entire identity. Champagne music. He had the name, he had the sound, and now he had to build the machine around them. The financial records discovered in Welk's personal archive represent some of the most striking material researchers found, and they tell a story that stands in sharp contrast to the warm, folksy persona he cultivated so carefully on screen. By the peak of his television career in the 1960s, Lawrence Welk was worth approximately $150 million. He controlled music publishing rights and record labels. He owned the syndication arrangements for his own program. He had invested heavily in real estate and was developing significant landholdings in California. He understood intellectual property, recurring income streams, and the mathematics of compound wealth in a way that most entertainers of his era simply did not. Meanwhile, the musicians who appeared beside him on screen week after week, men and women who were central to the program's appeal and who in some cases became beloved figures in their own right, were earning approximately $110 per week. That gap between what the show's performers earned and what its owner accumulated is not a minor footnote. It is central to understanding who Lawrence Welk actually was. He did not become wealthy by being generous. He became wealthy by maintaining extraordinary control over every financial arrangement in his orbit, and by ensuring that the loyalty and talent of his performers enriched primarily himself. The archive also reveals extensive documentation of his 1970 purchase of 1,000 acres in Escondido, California for $3.2 million, where he developed the Lawrence Welk Village, a resort, retirement community, golf course, and entertainment complex that essentially allowed fans to purchase a lifestyle built around his brand. This was not a vanity project. It was a sophisticated business decision made by a man who understood that his television audience would eventually age out of the medium's interest while remaining loyal to him personally. He was selling them not just entertainment but an identity, and the village gave that identity a physical address. It was, decades before the term entered common usage, a lifestyle brand.